Millions of weapons, rifles and tanks and aircraft and ships, assembled as fast as human hands could manage, and then shipped off to places so far away and so different from any factory floor that the distance alone seemed impossible. Jungles, frozen steppes, desert, remote islands in oceans most of the workers had never seen. And out there, in those places, the weapons broke. Not because they were hit, not because the enemy destroyed them. They broke on their own, quietly, at the worst possible moment. The torpedo that should have exploded didn't. The tank that was never touched caught fire. The radio went silent at exactly the moment a voice was needed most. These are those stories, and there is something oddly peaceful about hearing them now. These problems have already been solved. These moments of failure are history, settled and distant, with nothing left to threaten anyone. So let your eyes rest, if they want to. And let's begin. Fact number 1. There was a submarine commander somewhere in the Pacific who had done everything exactly right. He had tracked his target for hours. He had positioned his boat perfectly. He had waited with the kind of patience that only years of training can build. And then he fired. Nothing happened. He fired again. Still nothing. The torpedo he was using, the Mark 14, went to war carrying 3 separate flaws that its designers had never found because they had never truly tested it under real conditions. It ran deeper than it was set to. Its magnetic trigger fired too soon before it even reached the ship. And when it did make contact, the firing pin was so poorly made that it simply crumpled on impact instead of detonating. The submarine commanders who experienced this filed report after report. They were told the torpedoes were fine. They were told the crews were doing something wrong. It took 21 months before the Navy finally admitted the truth and fixed the problems. 21 months, and all that time, Japanese ships that should have been on the ocean floor were still sailing. Fact number 2. Germany had spent months preparing for the Battle of Kursk, months of waiting, of delays, of Hitler insisting they hold back until the new Panther tanks were ready. The generals were frustrated, but the order stood. Wait for the Panthers. And then, on the very first day of the battle, roughly half of the 200 Panthers that rolled forward broke down before they ever reached the Soviet lines. The engine was new and powerful, but it had been rushed into production without enough testing. It overheated. Oil leaked onto hot surfaces and caught fire. The system that transferred power from the engine to the tracks was not built to handle the weight of the vehicle. Panthers that didn't catch fire shed their tracks. Panthers that didn't shed their tracks failed in other ways their crews couldn't fix in the field. The tank that was supposed to break open the Soviet defenses broke itself instead. The ones that survived were eventually improved and became formidable machines. But at Kursk, at the one battle where they might have changed everything, they sat in the mud with their engines burning, and the Soviet guns found them where they stopped. Fact number 3. A pilot coming back from a bombing mission over Europe had been in the air for hours. He was cold. His oxygen supply at high altitude had been just enough to keep him thinking, but not enough to keep him sharp. And now he was descending toward the runway, and he reached for the controls. He grabbed the wrong one. The B-17 Flying Fortress had 2 controls positioned side by side, almost identical in shape and feel. One raised the landing gear. One adjusted the flaps. Pilots coming home exhausted, sometimes barely coherent from hours at altitude, reached for one and grabbed the other. Around 400 accidents happened this way before anyone understood what was going on. The solution came from a psychologist, not an engineer. A man named Alphonse Chapanis suggested something simple. Add a small rubber wheel to the landing gear control. Add a small flap shape to the flap control. Now your fingers could tell them apart without looking. From this one elegant fix grew an entire field of study. The idea that equipment should be designed around the limits of human beings under stress. The B-17's mistake quietly taught the world something important about how machines and people need to fit together. Fact number 4. The Sherman tank had a nickname among the men who drove it. They called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter that was advertised as lighting first time, every time. It burned. When an armor-piercing shell broke through the hull, The ammunition stored inside, stacked along the sides and floor of the fighting compartment, frequently ignited with a speed that gave the crew almost no time to get out. A modification came in 1944. The ammunition bins were surrounded by containers of water that absorbed heat and slowed ignition. It worked. The fire problem dropped significantly, but the modification came late, after thousands of Shermans had already burned, and after the men who drove them had developed a very specific awareness of what their vehicle would do when it was hit. A man who knows his tank will burn if penetrated fights differently from a man who trusts his vehicle. That difference is hard to measure, but it was real, and it was present in every crew that climbed into a Sherman and thought, even briefly, about what the Ronson lighter meant. The Sherman was reliable, easy to maintain, and available in vast numbers. It was exactly what Allied logistics needed, and for too long it was also a vehicle that killed its crew when it was hit, and everyone inside it knew it. Fact number 5. The German Tiger tank was genuinely frightening. Its gun could destroy any Allied tank before the Allied tank could effectively respond. Its armor was thick enough to survive hits that would have ended a lighter vehicle. Allied crews who met one in the field spoke about the encounter afterward in a particular way. But the Tiger broke down constantly. It drank fuel at a rate the German supply system could rarely keep up with, and keeping one running was a full-time occupation for everyone around it. The wheel system was part of the problem. The Tiger used overlapping rows of road wheels, each row sitting between the others, designed to spread the vehicle's weight more evenly. It was a clever solution to a real engineering problem, until mud packed itself between the wheels and the temperature dropped. On the Eastern Front, Tiger crews discovered that if it got cold enough overnight, those overlapping wheels would freeze into a single solid mass. No amount of effort would move the tank until the ice thawed or until something warmer was brought in. So crews ran their engines in the middle of the night, in the dark, in the freezing cold, just to keep the wheels from locking. A tank that requires maintenance at 2 in the morning to remain mobile is a tank whose complexity has quietly become its own enemy. Fact number 6. Cold doesn't announce itself the way an explosion does. It just arrives, and then it gets into everything. When the German Ardennes offensive began in December 1944, American soldiers found themselves in one of the coldest European winters in decades, and many of them were not equipped for it. Rifles jammed. The lubricating oil in their mechanisms had congealed in temperatures that dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Machine guns seized. Vehicle engines refused to start in the morning, and when they did start, they ran poorly until warmed up, which the tactical situation rarely allowed time for. The standard American cold weather jacket was not made for what the Belgian Ardennes delivered that December. Soldiers improvised. German blankets, civilian clothing from empty houses, anything they could wrap around themselves or their feet. Trench foot and frostbite became medical emergencies, consuming evacuation capacity and medical resources at the exact moment both were desperately needed elsewhere. This kind of failure doesn't look dramatic. There's no fireball, just cold and stiffness and equipment that was designed for a different kind of winter than the one that showed up. It wore the army down from the outside in, quietly and incrementally, and the men standing in the mud felt every degree of it. Fact number 7. On the evening of the 5th of June 1944, paratroopers climbed into their aircraft with everything they would need for what was about to happen, or at least everything they were supposed to have. Many of the weapons didn't make it to the ground intact. The opening shock of the parachute was violent. Equipment strapped to soldiers was sometimes torn free entirely. Men landed scattered, separated from the containers that had been dropped alongside them, in fields and marshes that had been deliberately flooded by the Germans to make exactly this worse. The paratrooper's carbine, the folding stock version designed for airborne use, was already known to be less reliable than the standard carbine. Some soldiers had quietly obtained the full-length version before the jump anyway, against regulations, because they knew men who came down in flooded marshes lost weapons and radios to the water. Some landed with almost nothing on them that still worked, and through those first dark hours of the most important operation in the European war, they fought with whatever they had managed to keep, which was sometimes very little. Not because of cowardice, not because of poor planning entirely, because the violence of the drop and the darkness and the water took things from them before they even began. Fact number 8. The radio was supposed to make modern warfare coherent. It was the tool that would connect commanders to their units, that would allow coordination across the chaos of a battlefield, that would replace the old and dangerous practice of sending runners through fire. In practice, it failed constantly, and it failed in the worst possible way, not completely but intermittently, working when things were calm, going silent at exactly the moment the situation became urgent. The standard American infantry backpack radio was a reasonable piece of equipment for its time, but its batteries ran down faster than expected. Its range shrank in mountains, in hedgerows, in the dense terrain of places that hadn't been part of the flat ground testing range where the specifications were written. Units a quarter of a mile apart could be as effectively cut off from each other as if they were on different continents. Commanders who had built their plans around the assumption of continuous communication discovered, in the middle of battles, that communication was actually the exception rather than the rule. Some of them adjusted, some didn't. And in the gap between the radio that was supposed to work and the radio that actually worked, battles unfolded without the coordination that everyone had assumed would be there. Fact number 9. There was a period early in the Pacific War when the United States Navy was, in a very real sense, fighting with its hands tied. The torpedo's magnetic exploder, the device designed to sense the magnetic field of a steel ship's hull and detonate the warhead before contact, had been developed in such secrecy that it had almost never been tested against an actual ship. Near the equator, the Earth's magnetic field behaves differently than it does at the latitudes where the device was designed. The trigger fired early, sometimes 50 yards before the torpedo reached the hull, producing an explosion in open water. The target was unharmed, and now it knew a submarine was nearby. Submarine commanders reported this. They were told their firing angles were wrong. They adjusted and reported again. They were told it was their maintenance. Months passed. The institutional resistance to admitting that the Navy had sent its submarine force to war with a defective weapon, one so secret that no one had verified it worked, held firm against every piece of evidence. The commanders eventually ran their own tests. They caught warheads in nets to show the contact exploders were shearing on impact. They demonstrated everything they had been saying for over a year. It took 21 months. And all that time, the ships that should have been sinking were still sailing. Fact number 10. The Japanese Zero was extraordinary. In the first year of the Pacific War, it had a range and maneuverability that genuinely alarmed the American pilots who encountered it. It could climb faster than anything they were flying. It could turn inside almost anything in the air. It also had no armor protecting the pilot, and no self-sealing fuel tanks. That was a deliberate decision. The weight saved by removing protection was the weight that gave the Zero its range and agility. It was a trade-off that worked brilliantly when the Zero was facing opponents who didn't yet understand it. And then American pilots learned. They stopped trying to outturn it. They used diving attacks where American aircraft were faster. They aimed for the fuel tanks, which ignited from a single brief burst, turning the Zero into a fireball almost before the burst was complete. The aircraft that had seemed almost untouchable turned out to have been a machine whose performance only worked as long as it wasn't hit. Once American pilots understood how to hit it, the Zero's remarkable capabilities became irrelevant. What had seemed like invulnerability was actually a very precise kind of fragility. And once the fragility was found, the Zero was never quite the same again. Fact number 11. The boots that American soldiers wore into the mountains of Italy in the autumn of 1943 were designed for a different kind of war than the one they found there. The standard army service boot was a leather ankle boot, fine for the dry dust of a training camp, not fine for the cold, the wet, and the mud of the Apennines in autumn, where soldiers spent days without being able to remove or dry them. Trench foot crept in slowly, the feet swelled, blisters formed. In severe cases, the tissue began to die. During the Italian campaign, trenchfoot casualties sometimes exceeded combat casualties in front-line units. The army responded. New boot designs were ordered. Waterproofing materials were sent forward. Wool socks were prioritized. But the supply chain was already overwhelmed. and changes to standard kit moved through bureaucratic processes that took months while the men who needed different boots were still standing in the mud with the ones they had. This was not a failure of courage. It was the failure of an assumption, the quiet, institutional belief that equipment adequate for training would be adequate for war. That assumption met the Italian winter, and the Italian winter was not interested in what the assumption said. Fact number 12. The British Covenanter tank was built in larger numbers than almost any other British armoured vehicle of the early war. Over 1,700 of them were produced between 1940 and 1943. Not a single one was ever used in combat. Not because the war didn't need tanks, not because they weren't available, but because everyone who examined the Covenanter understood that sending it into battle would be sending its crews to their deaths. The cooling system was fundamentally wrong. A design decision had placed the radiator on the incorrect side of the engine, which meant the crew compartment overheated to dangerous temperatures even in British weather. In the North African desert, it would have been catastrophic. The engine was underpowered, the transmission was unreliable. One official assessment simply described it as utterly useless. So the Covenanters spent the war in Britain, teaching tank crews the basics of armoured operations on equipment that could not be trusted to fight. The crews who trained on it understood they were learning on machines that would kill them if taken seriously. Over 1,700 tanks, not one in combat, a quiet monument to the impossibility of testing everything before ordering everything at once, when the war was moving faster than anyone could follow. Fact number 13. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was the world's first operational jet fighter, and it was so far ahead of anything the Allies had in the air that its arrival should have had consequences far larger than it did. The reason it didn't comes down, in significant part, to its engines. The Junkers Jumo 004 was built from substitute materials. The high-quality alloys the design required were no longer available in Germany, so inferior materials were used instead. The result was an engine with a service life of roughly 25 hours before it needed to be rebuilt. It was also prone to flame out, a sudden loss of combustion that could happen at certain throttle settings. This was dangerous at altitude. At low altitude, during takeoff and landing, it was potentially fatal. The aircraft needed slow, careful throttle movements to avoid it, which meant the period just after takeoff, when the Me-262 was slow, low, and committed to a straight path, was a window of genuine vulnerability. Allied pilots learned to wait above Me-262 airfields and attack during exactly that window. A revolutionary aircraft, grounded again and again by engines that couldn't outlast the material shortages consuming Germany from within. Fact number 14. The Italian campaign produced a particular kind of equipment failure. Not a failure of design exactly, a failure of scale and terrain. Vehicles that worked perfectly on the flat plains of England, or across the open desert of North Africa, arrived at the mountains of central Italy and simply could not cope. Trucks rated for specific loads broke their axles on roads that climbed at gradients no specification had accounted for. Tank recovery vehicles that could pull a disabled Sherman from soft ground in open country could not reach tanks that had broken down on mountain tracks barely wide enough for the tank itself. Artillery pieces designed for open field deployment required hours of effort to move into mountain firing positions, and when the gradient became too steep even for that, mules were brought in. Ancient technology pressed back into service because the machines had failed. The mules didn't always survive it either. The gap between the environment in which equipment was tested and the environment in which it was used was never wider than in Italy, and the cost of that gap was measured in breakdowns, in lost time, and in the exhaustion of men who spent as much energy moving and maintaining their equipment as they ever spent fighting. Fact number 15. A parachute that failed to open was not simply a malfunction. It was a specific, terrible meeting of a human life and a mechanical failure in the worst possible place for either. Wartime parachutes were not precision equipment. They were military kit, produced in enormous quantities under pressure, packed as fast as workers could manage, and used in conditions that no quality control process could fully prepare them for. Pack failure was a known risk. Everyone in airborne operations understood it. The canopy that didn't deploy correctly, the lines that tangled, the parachute that streamed rather than inflated. These things happened, and they were accepted as part of the cost. What was less discussed was the failure that happened before the jump was even made. Paratroopers hit by flak or fighter fire while still in the aircraft. Men wounded but not killed before they reached the door. Men whose parachutes had been torn by shrapnel on the way down, damaged before they were ever deployed. No pre-jump inspection could prevent those failures. They arrived from outside, from the air around the aircraft, in the seconds before the jump that was supposed to be the last seconds of relative safety. The parachute was the last piece of equipment between the soldier and the ground. When it failed, there was nothing after it. Fact number 16. The German army that crossed into the Soviet Union in June 1941 brought vehicles that had been designed and tested primarily in Western Europe. The Soviet road network was something else entirely. Much of the country's interior was connected not by paved roads but by dirt tracks, and those tracks did things to German vehicles that no European testing ground had ever reproduced. The trucks and half-tracks and motorcycles that had performed reliably in France began to fail in the Soviet dust and mud at rates that overwhelmed the repair systems behind them. Then the autumn rains came. The dirt tracks turned to mud of a depth and consistency that stopped the German advance more effectively than the Red Army had managed. Vehicles sank to their axles. Engines sucked in dust that destroyed their filters and wore down their pistons. The standard lubricating oil congealed in the Soviet winter at temperatures it had never been formulated to handle. By December 1941, the Wehrmacht was within sight of Moscow. A significant portion of its motor transport was inoperable. An army that had conquered most of Europe in 2 years was being stopped, partly by the failure of its own equipment to cope with conditions its designers had never built it for. The road that wasn't a road had done what the enemy could not. Fact number 17. The American M3 Lee tank arrived in North Africa in 1942 with a problem that no modification could fix. Its main gun was not mounted in a rotating turret. It was fitted into a spunson on the right side of the hull, which meant the entire tank had to be turned bodily to aim the weapon at anything to the left. In the fluid, fast-moving armored battles of the Western Desert, where tanks needed to engage targets in any direction at any moment, this was a crippling limitation. British crews who received the Lee described the experience of trying to engage an enemy tank to their left as a series of maneuvers that took time the battle simply did not provide. The tank sat high, presenting a large target. Its riveted hull meant that a penetrating hit sent rivets flying through the interior like secondary projectiles. It was underpowered in the desert heat. It was in almost every respect an interim solution. A tank that American engineers had designed to fill a gap while better vehicles were developed. It was sent into combat before it was ready, in conditions that exposed every one of its compromises simultaneously. The men who fought in it knew what it was. They fought in it anyway, because it was what had arrived. Fact number 18. The Battle of Britain was decided by many things: the radar chain, the ground control system, the courage of the pilots. But one of the factors that decided it was the fuel capacity of a German fighter. The Messerschmitt Bf 109E used a fuel injection system rather than the carburetor fitted to British Spitfires and Hurricanes. This was mostly an advantage. Fuel injection kept the engine running at -G, while carburetor-fed British fighters briefly lost power when they pushed into a steep dive. German pilots learned to exploit this, pushing over into dives that British fighters couldn't immediately follow. But the fuel injection system consumed fuel at a rate that gave the Bf 109E approximately 10 minutes of combat time over London, before it had to turn back for France. 10 minutes was not long enough. Not long enough to escort bombers to the target and back. Not long enough to sustain a prolonged fight with defending squadrons. Not long enough to achieve the air superiority the entire Luftwaffe operational plan required. The Battle of Britain was decided by many factors. One of them was that a very capable German aircraft had been designed without its fuel consumption being matched to the operational demands that were going to be placed upon it. Fact number 19. Some of the war's most dangerous failures were the ones that almost worked. The proximity fuse was an electronic device fitted to artillery shells that detonated the shell when it came within a certain distance of its target, rather than requiring a direct hit. When it worked, it was one of the most important weapons innovations of the war. When it failed, it detonated over the troops who had fired it. Early versions were sensitive to rain, to clouds, to nearby metal, to radio interference. Any of these could cause premature detonation. Years of testing went into eliminating these failure modes before the fuse was trusted near ground troops. Allied forces were careful not to use proximity fuses over land targets in the European theater until late in the war, partly for fear that captured duds would allow German engineers to copy the technology. The caution was justified. It was also expensive. There were situations where the fuse would have been enormously effective, and the decision to hold it back meant those opportunities were missed. The proximity fuse that was too dangerous to use over your own troops was a weapon whose very safety requirements had constrained it as much as its capabilities had enabled it. A weapon held back by how well it might have worked in the wrong moment. Fact number 20. The T-34 has a reputation as one of the best tanks of the war. Well-armored, well-armed, reliable enough for the enormous demands of the Eastern Front, simple enough to maintain in the field with basic tools. That reputation is broadly deserved, but it was not yet deserved in 1941. The early T-34 had a two-man turret where the commander also had to serve as the gunner, which left him no time to watch the battlefield while he was operating the weapon. Radios were available in only a small fraction of early models. Most T-34 crews communicated by flag signals, which in the chaos of tank combat was about as effective as it sounds. The transmission was so difficult to operate that drivers sometimes carried hammers to force the gear lever into position. The vision ports were poorly placed, leaving blind spots around the vehicle that crews couldn't see from inside. None of these are the problems the T-34 is famous for. They are the problems of the specific, real vehicle that met the German army in 1941, before the improvements came, before the production stabilized, before the tank became the machine that history remembers. Many of the losses the Red Army suffered in those first terrible months were partly paid for by equipment that was not yet what it would later become. Fact number 21. The landing craft that carried Allied soldiers onto the beaches at Normandy had a bow ramp, a steel door that lowered to let the men out onto the beach or into the water. On many of the Higgins boats, this ramp was operated by a cable that could jam, causing it to drop unevenly or not at all. On Omaha Beach, where the resistance was heaviest and the casualties were highest, ramps that failed to lower properly trapped soldiers behind a steel wall they couldn't get through, while fire swept across the boat from the shore. Soldiers who couldn't get the ramp down went over the sides instead, into water that was sometimes over their heads, weighed down by their equipment. The ramp malfunction was not the primary cause of what happened at Omaha. The current, the obstacles, the failure of the preliminary bombardment, the specific quality of German resistance in that sector, all of these mattered more. But the jammed ramps were there, and they were real, and the men trapped behind them while fire came over the bow are part of the equipment failure story of that morning, in ways the official accounts rarely pause to acknowledge. Fact number 22. The German Luftwaffe's Heinkel He-177 was supposed to be Germany's strategic heavy bomber, the aircraft that could carry large bomb loads to British cities and to Soviet industrial centers beyond reach of anything else. It was never used effectively for this purpose, mainly because its engines caught fire. The He-177 used an unusual arrangement, 4 engines coupled in pairs to drive just 2 propellers, designed to reduce drag. In practice, the coupled engines concentrated heat and made the lubricating oil prone to reaching ignition temperature during sustained flight. He-177 crews gave it a nickname. They called it the Flying Lighter, the same name Sherman tank crews used for a completely different machine on a completely different battlefield, both earning the same grim distinction of being famous among the people inside them for catching fire without any help from the enemy. The He-177 went through years of development. It consumed enormous resources. It occupied the attention of the German aircraft industry at a time when that attention could have been directed elsewhere. And it never achieved what it was designed to do because its engines set it on fire. Fact number 23. The American Army Air Forces lost more aircraft in non-combat accidents than in combat during the first 2 years of the war. This is not widely remembered, and official accounts sometimes quietly move past it. But it is true, and it matters. Aircraft that crashed during training, during ferry flights, during landing and takeoff accidents that had nothing to do with enemy action. These losses consumed production capacity, trained aircrew, and time that the war could not give back. The rate of accidents was high enough that the Army Air Forces brought in psychologists to study why they happened and what changes to training, equipment, and procedures might reduce them. The work that came out of this effort, the study of pilot error, the redesign of cockpits, the development of standardized checklists, became some of the most important safety engineering of the 20th century. But the reason it was needed was that the equipment, combined with the compressed training timelines of wartime aviation, was producing accidents at a rate that could not be ignored. The B-17 landing gear confusion described earlier was part of a larger pattern. Machines too complex, too demanding, too unforgiving, being operated by people who had been learning for months rather than years. Fact number 24. The Japanese Oka was a piloted, rocket-powered flying bomb, designed to be dropped from a mother aircraft and then guided to its target by the pilot sitting inside it. It was explicitly a weapon of one-way travel. The pilot was not expected to return. Even on its own terms, it frequently failed. The aircraft that carried it, the Mitsubishi G4M, was already slow and vulnerable. Carrying the Oka beneath its fuselage made it slower and more vulnerable still. American combat patrols often shot down the carriers before they could release the Oka within useful range of their targets. When it was released, the Oka's rocket engines burned for only a brief time. The pilot had a short window to guide the weapon onto a target before the rockets exhausted themselves, and the Oka became an unpowered glider with very limited control. Of those that were released and reached their target area, many missed. The few that connected with Allied ships caused damage. But the weapon's overall record, measured against the resources consumed and the lives given for it, was one of the most expensive failures of the Japanese war effort. A weapon that required the deaths of its operators and often fell short regardless. Fact number 25. Sand is the enemy of machinery in ways that engineers in temperate climates sometimes don't fully appreciate until the machinery is actually in the desert. The North African campaign was a sustained lesson in what fine dust does to engines, to weapons, to vehicles, and to the men maintaining them. The dust of the Libyan desert penetrated everything. Air filters changed daily were saturated by midday. Engine wear that was measured in thousands of miles in European conditions was measured in hundreds in the desert. Aircraft engines ingested dust that eroded compressor blades and combustion chambers faster than replacement could keep pace with. Weapons required cleaning twice a day to remain reliable, and in the middle of a battle, twice a day was a luxury. The Germans had designed vehicle air filters better suited to North African conditions than those initially used by British forces, which gave them a maintenance advantage in the early part of the campaign. The British and Americans eventually developed their own improved filters, but the development came after the desert had demonstrated the problem, not before. The standard pattern, almost without exception, was the same throughout the war. The environment taught the lesson. The factories tried to catch up, and the men in the field lived inside the gap between the two. Fact number 26. The M2 flamethrower was effective against fortified positions, particularly the bunkers and pillboxes that Japanese forces used throughout the Pacific Island campaign. It was also one of the most physically dangerous pieces of equipment that any infantryman was asked to carry. The fuel tanks on the operator's back contained napalm under pressure. A bullet, a fragment of shrapnel, almost anything that penetrated those tanks, turned the operator into a human torch with no recourse. Flamethrower operators had the lowest life expectancy of any specialist role in Pacific infantry operations, and they were aware of it. Beyond that, the mechanical problems were constant. The igniter that started the flame was vulnerable to moisture, and the Pacific's humidity made moisture a permanent condition. An operator who crawled through jungle undergrowth to reach a pillbox and found his igniter had failed, had no primary weapon, and had announced his position to anyone nearby. The backup igniter required the operator to be even closer to the target. Closer, under fire, working a malfunctioning piece of equipment full of burning fuel. The men who did this were not thinking about engineering specifications. They were thinking about getting close enough to make the thing work before something stopped them from doing it. Fact number 27. The British airborne forces that landed at Arnhem in September 1944 discovered, within hours of touching down, that their radios did not work. The communications plan for Operation Market Garden had been built around the assumption that the radios would function across the range and terrain of the Arnhem area. That assumption was wrong. The number 22 set used by the British 1st Airborne Division had an effective range in the densely built and hilly terrain around Arnhem that was far shorter than the operational plan required. Units that had landed miles apart and needed to coordinate their movements could not reach each other. Brigade headquarters could not reach division headquarters. The commanders who were supposed to direct one of the most ambitious Allied operations of the war were fighting blind. No information coming in about what was happening elsewhere. No orders going out. No way to correct plans that were going catastrophically wrong. Arnhem is remembered most often as a story of overconfidence and German response. A bridge too far, in the famous phrase. It was also a story of a communications failure so complete that the force's ability to function as a coordinated unit was broken before it had ever really had a chance to fight the battle it had come to fight. Fact number 28. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was the primary American fighter at the time of Pearl Harbor, and it served throughout the early war in every theater where American air forces operated. It was rugged, reliable, and in the right hands effective, but its supercharger was optimized for low and medium altitude. Above around 15,000 feet, its performance declined sharply, while the aircraft it was most often asked to fight performed better up high. American pilots in the Pacific and in China quickly understood that meeting Japanese aircraft at high altitude in a P-40 was choosing a disadvantage before the fight even began. The tactics they developed were in some sense workarounds for an equipment limitation, rather than expressions of an ideal doctrine. Diving attacks from superior altitude, avoiding sustained high-altitude engagements, using the P-40's diving speed and durability, while staying away from the fights where its weakness showed most. Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers built their entire tactical approach around the P-40's specific combination of strengths and limitations. The tactics worked well enough. They worked because the people using the equipment had looked at it honestly, understood exactly what it could and couldn't do, and built their methods around both. The limitation was real. The response to it was quietly remarkable. Fact number 29. People who think of the German army as a mechanized force are often surprised to learn how many horses it used. In June 1941, the German army that crossed into the Soviet Union included approximately 625,000 horses. They were not a backup system or a relic. They were the primary means of pulling artillery, supply wagons, and the enormous weight of material that available motor transport could not carry. And in the Soviet winter, horses died. They died of cold, of exhaustion, of disease, of inadequate fodder, and of the specific demands of Soviet roads that were harder on hooves than on wheels. The mortality rate was catastrophic, and the death of horses was the death of mobility for the units that depended on them. An artillery battery that could not move its guns because its horses were dead was not an artillery battery. The irony is quietly remarkable. The German army, famous for its armored innovations, was stopped in part by the failure of an ancient technology whose limits every medieval army had also discovered. The horse did not fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because it was a living thing, placed in conditions that living things could not survive. Fact number 30. The M1 Garand rifle is generally described as one of the great successes of wartime small arms. General Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. That reputation is largely deserved. It was accurate, reliable, and semi-automatic at a time when most armies were still issuing bolt-action rifles. But the Garand had one famous quirk that every soldier who used it eventually noticed. When the last round was fired, the metal clip that held the ammunition ejected from the rifle with a distinct metallic ping, audible at some distance in quiet conditions. In the close jungle fighting of the Pacific, where ranges were short and the enemy was near, This sound could announce that an American soldier had just fired his last round and needed to reload. A piece of information that a skilled opponent could potentially exploit. Whether the Garand ping actually contributed to casualties in meaningful numbers is debated. The reloading time was short, and the sound was not always distinct in the noise of a real firefight, but soldiers noticed it. They talked about it. They worried about it. And that itself is revealing. Equipment failures and quirks lived in the minds of the people using them, shaping how they fought and how they felt about what they were carrying, sometimes long after the practical risk had passed. Fact number 31. The Maginot Line was the largest and most expensive piece of military equipment in European history. A chain of fortifications along the French-German border that represented France's entire theory about how the next war would be fought. The construction cost approximately 3 billion francs. The fortifications themselves were extraordinary. Underground complexes with their own power plants, hospitals, railways, and living quarters. Guns protected by meters of reinforced concrete, designed to be impervious to any known weapon. When Germany attacked France in May 1940, the Maginot Line performed exactly as designed. Not a single fortress was captured by direct assault. The German army simply went around it, through Belgium and Luxembourg, through the Ardennes forest that French military planners had declared impassable for armor, emerging behind the Maginot Line and making it irrelevant within days. The most expensive fortification ever built failed not because it was poorly constructed, but because the assumption underneath it was wrong. The assumption that an enemy will attack where you have prepared for them to attack. The Maginot Line was a perfect answer to a question that Germany had no intention of asking. The technology worked. The strategy it was built to serve did not. Fact number 32. The Sherman tank used a Continental radial aircraft engine to produce its power. This made sense from a production standpoint. The engine was already being manufactured in large numbers for aircraft use, and using it in a tank simplified the supply chain. But it ran on high-octane aviation gasoline, which was more volatile than the diesel fuel used by most German tanks, and more prone to igniting when the tank was penetrated. This layered on top of the ammunition storage problem to produce a tank that burned with particular speed and completeness. Fuel that ignited easily, combined with ammunition stored in positions that fragments could reach, in a confined space from which escape required seconds that the fire rarely provided. Later Sherman variants switched to diesel fuel, and the fire problem was reduced. But the change came after the petrol-engine Shermans had already established the tank's reputation. The decision to use an aircraft engine in a tank was not irrational. It was a production decision made under pressure, balancing the need for many tanks against the ideal of perfect tanks. The wartime production system made this trade-off constantly, and was consistently right that having enough tanks mattered more than having fewer better ones. The cost of that trade-off was paid by the crews inside the ones that burned. Fact number 33. The Soviet Union entered the war in 1941 with an enormous number of tanks on paper, and a crippling shortage of everything needed to keep them running. The KV-1 heavy tank was in theory formidable, heavily armored, carrying a powerful gun, capable of absorbing hits that would destroy any German tank of the period. In practice, its mechanical reliability was poor, its transmission was frequently defective from the factory, and the Soviet maintenance system in 1941 was too disorganized to keep vehicles running for more than a few hundred kilometers. Entire KV-1 battalions were lost not to German fire, but to mechanical breakdown. Tanks abandoned at the roadside because the gearbox had failed and there was no way to fix it in the field. No recovery vehicle capable of moving a tank that weighed nearly 50 tons. German forces advancing through the Soviet Union that summer photographed and documented abandoned Soviet tanks in their hundreds, machines that had never been hit, sitting at the side of the road with failures that better maintenance or better design would have prevented. Each one represented an investment of Soviet industrial capacity that produced nothing except evidence of what happens when the pressure to build outpaces the capacity to maintain what has been built. Fact number 34. The German 88mm anti-aircraft gun is one of the most famous weapons of the war. Equally effective against aircraft and against the Allied tanks it was pressed into anti-tank service against in the Western Desert. Feared by tank crews across every theater, respected by everyone who encountered it. But the weapon had a limitation that its reputation sometimes obscures. It was heavy, it was tall, and deploying it into a concealed firing position required effort and time that the pace of armored battle did not always allow. The gun was designed for anti-aircraft use, which required it to elevate to high angles, which required a high carriage, which made it visible above the horizon from significant distances. Tank commanders who spotted the distinctive silhouette of an 88 on a ridgeline had time to engage it, to maneuver out of its line of fire, or to call in artillery. The weapon's height, which was a requirement of its original function, became a disadvantage in ground combat because it made concealment almost impossible. The 88 destroyed enormous numbers of Allied tanks. It also announced its own position in a way that the guns it was killing did not, and the crews operating it knew that being seen was the beginning of the end of their own survival. Fact number 35. The Hawker Typhoon was introduced as a Royal Air Force interceptor in 1941, and it immediately began killing its own pilots. The early Typhoon had a structural weakness in the tail assembly, a joint between the rear fuselage and the tail that was prone to failure under the stresses of combat maneuvers. Aircraft entered high-speed dives and lost their tails. Pilots reported strange vibrations, and then there was nothing left to report. The accident rate in the first months of the Typhoon's service was severe enough that there were serious discussions about withdrawing it from frontline use entirely. The problem was identified, the structural joint was reinforced, and the Typhoon went on to become one of the most effective ground attack aircraft of the war, particularly in the Normandy campaign, where Typhoon squadrons armed with rockets devastated German armored columns trying to move by day. But the first year of its service was paid for by pilots who trusted a machine that had not yet been made trustworthy. The gap between in service and reliable was measured in deaths, as it so often was in the accelerated development timelines of wartime aviation. The aircraft that history remembers as a success was, for a time, a machine that its own pilots had reason to fear. Fact number 36. The Japanese Army's Type 97 Chiha medium tank was the most widely used Japanese armored vehicle of the war. It was adequate for the campaigns of 1937 and 1938 against Chinese forces that had limited anti-tank capability. By the time American armor met it in the Pacific Island campaigns, it was years out of date. Its gun could not penetrate the frontal armor of a Sherman at any combat range. The Sherman's 75mm gun could destroy it easily. Japanese tank crews fighting in the Philippines and on Pacific Islands in 1944 and 1945 were operating equipment that had no realistic chance of defeating what it was facing. They knew this. They used tactics to try to work around the gap, hull-down positions, ambushes, suicide charges. But working around an armor gap of that magnitude with tactics alone was not possible. The failure of Japan to develop better tanks reflects a specific institutional problem. The Japanese military did not prioritize armored warfare the way the Germans, Soviets, and Americans did, and by the time the deficiency was apparent, the industrial capacity and the materials to address it were no longer available. This kind of failure is in some ways harder to fix than a faulty torpedo or a broken radio. It was not a component that could be repaired. It was a design that had simply been outpaced, and there was nothing left to do about it. Fact number 37. The American Army faced a specific kind of equipment failure in the Pacific jungle that had nothing to do with combat, and everything to do with the environment. Everything corroded, rotted, or was consumed. Leather equipment developed mold within days. Metal corroded at rates that would have seemed impossible in temperate conditions. Webbing rotted. Canvas deteriorated. The lubricating oil in weapons separated in the heat and ran out of the mechanisms, leaving the working parts exposed to moisture that accelerated rusting. Optical equipment, binoculars, gun sights, camera lenses, developed fungal growth on the glass that degraded the image and eventually made them useless. Soldiers in New Guinea and other Pacific campaigns described spending as much time fighting their own equipment's tendency to dissolve in the environment as they spent fighting the enemy. The Army had not anticipated the specific combination of heat, humidity, and biological activity that the Pacific jungle produced. The equipment issued was designed with other conditions as its primary constraint. The solutions came during the war: better sealants, humidity-resistant lubricants, fungicidal treatments for optical glass, developed partly from the field reports of soldiers who were watching their equipment fail around them in real time. The jungle taught the lesson. The factory tried to catch up. The soldiers lived in the gap. Fact number 38. The mines that Allied forces cleared from beaches and fields across the war were pieces of equipment that usually worked exactly as designed. The ones that failed created a different kind of problem. A cleared minefield was a minefield that had been mapped, swept, and marked as passable. A cleared minefield with a percentage of undiscovered failed mines was a path that engineers had certified as safe, and that would kill the next person to step in exactly the wrong place. The failure rate of German shoe mines, wooden-cased anti-personnel mines designed to evade metal detectors, was low enough that most of them worked as intended, but high enough that a cleared path was never entirely trustworthy. Sappers who cleared mines knew they were working to a statistical confidence rather than a certainty. The mines they found were not necessarily all the mines there were. The equipment that failed by not detonating was in some ways more dangerous than equipment that failed by detonating early. It created the illusion of safety in the space between the last mine found and the next mine that hadn't been found yet. That space, unmarked, uncounted, was where the cleared path ended and the uncleared path began again. And it looked exactly the same. Fact number 39. Dive bombing placed enormous stress on both the aircraft and the pilot. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka entered a near vertical dive, released its bomb at a precise point, and then had to pull out before hitting the ground. The pullout produced G-forces that could render a pilot briefly unconscious. If that happened, the aircraft continued its dive with no one at the controls. The Stuka had automatic pull-out mechanisms specifically to address this. Devices that took over the controls during recovery if the pilot was incapacitated. They worked most of the time. When they failed, or when the dive was too steep and the altitude too low for the mechanism to complete the recovery in time, the aircraft hit the ground. The Stuka was also extremely vulnerable to any modern fighter that could reach it. Its slow speed and fixed undercarriage, the aerodynamic compromises that made dive bombing possible, made it easy prey for a competent interceptor. During the Battle of Britain, Stuka losses to RAF fighters were so severe that the aircraft had to be withdrawn from operations over southern England entirely. A weapon that was decisive against weak opposition became a liability the moment it faced a competent air defense, and no mechanical modification could address that fundamental limitation. The aircraft was what it was, and what it was had an answer. Fact number 40. The British Sten gun was one of the most widely manufactured weapons of the war. Approximately 4 million were produced, cheap enough to make in almost any machine shop, simple enough to be assembled without specialist skills. It was also one of the most unreliable. The Sten's magazine was a single-stack design that fed rounds from the side. The metal lips that held the rounds in position and guided them into the chamber were prone to deformation from rough handling, from being dropped, from the ordinary stress of loading and unloading. A deformed magazine lip caused rounds to feed improperly, jamming the weapon. The Sten jammed so frequently that soldiers and resistance fighters who depended on it developed specific drills for clearing jams under fire. Actions practiced until they were automatic, because in the moment the weapon stopped working, there was no time to think. Soviet agents dropped into occupied Europe who were issued a Sten knew its limitations intimately. Some of them quietly acquired German weapons instead, as soon as the situation allowed, because German weapons were generally more reliable. The Sten was cheap. It was available. It could be produced at the scale the war required. Reliability was the price paid for all three of those qualities. And it was a price paid, in the end, by the people who had to trust their lives to it. Fact number 41. The American P-38 Lightning was one of the most visually distinctive aircraft of the war. Twin-boomed, twin-engined, instantly recognizable from any angle. In the Pacific and the Mediterranean, it performed excellently. In the European theater, in the winter of 1943 and 1944, it was plagued by a specific failure that had serious consequences for the crews who flew it. The cockpit heating system was inadequate for high-altitude operations over Western Europe, where temperatures at 30,000 feet could reach -60 degrees Celsius. Pilots' hands froze on the controls. The oils in the propeller mechanisms congealed, causing the propellers to overspeed in ways the pilot could not control. The Allison engines, reliable in warmer conditions, became less dependable in extreme cold. American fighter pilots who flew the P-38 over Germany that winter described missions where the aircraft's mechanical problems were as dangerous as the Luftwaffe. The same aircraft, in warmer theaters, was exceptional. It was not a bad design. It was a design whose specific failure modes were triggered by a specific environment, and it was sent into that environment before those failure modes were fully understood or addressed. The cold found the places the designers hadn't looked. It always did. Fact number 42. The German Type 7 submarine was the primary weapon of the Battle of the Atlantic, and in the early part of the war it was devastatingly effective. By 1943, that had changed entirely. Improved Allied radar could detect surfaced submarines in darkness. Long-range aircraft closed the gaps in the mid-Atlantic that submarines had previously used freely. The Enigma codes were being read. The technology that had defined the Type 7's effectiveness, its ability to operate on the surface at night and evade convoy escorts, had been systematically negated. The Germans introduced an acoustic homing torpedo to address this, a weapon that followed the sound of a ship's propellers. It also followed the sound of the submarine's own propellers. German submariners discovered that their new weapon was capable of turning around and destroying the vessel that had fired it. The countermeasure was a noise-making device towed behind the submarine to attract the homing torpedo away from the hull. It worked most of the time. Not always. The acoustic torpedo that killed the submarine that fired it is one of the war's more grimly ironic equipment failures. A solution to one problem that introduced a new and immediate danger for the very crew it was supposed to help. Fact number 43. The Italian Carro Armato M1340 medium tank was the primary Italian armored vehicle in North Africa, and its deficiencies were significant. The engine was a diesel unit originally designed for marine use, underpowered for the weight of the vehicle it was moving. The cooling system was inadequate for desert heat, causing engines to overheat and seize. The armor was thin enough to be penetrated by weapons considered obsolete for anti-tank use in other armies. The radio was unreliable, mounted outside the turret in a way that made communication difficult during combat. The M1340 was not the result of Italian indifference or incompetence. It was the result of a nation that was industrially and economically ill-equipped for a war of the scale and duration it had entered. The tanks that Italian crews drove in the desert were the best Italy could produce at that moment. They simply were not as capable as what they faced. The men inside them knew this. They understood the gap between their equipment and the enemy's with the particular clarity that comes from being on the wrong side of it in a battle. And they fought anyway, with a courage that the quality of their equipment never fully reflected, and that the history of the campaign does not always pause long enough to acknowledge. Fact number 44. The barrage balloon was a large, gas-filled balloon tethered over cities and ports to prevent low-level bombing raids. The steel cables supporting it were under tension, and an aircraft that flew into one at speed was subject to forces that could remove a wing or slice through a fuselage. It was one of the cheaper pieces of air defense the British deployed. It was also, on at least several occasions, effective against the wrong aircraft. Allied planes returning to Britain, flying in bad weather, in darkness, navigating with equipment that was less precise than ideal, sometimes flew into the cables of the very balloons protecting the cities they were trying to reach. The British lost a number of aircraft and crews this way. Not a large number, but not zero. Each one a preventable death caused not by enemy action, but by the failure of the coordination system to reliably keep friendly aircraft out of the defended zones. The barrage balloon was simple, cheap, and effective at what it was designed to do. The failure was in the interface between the balloon and everything around it, in the assumption that friendly aircraft would always know exactly where they were and act accordingly. That assumption, like so many assumptions in the war, was almost always right. Almost always was not always. Fact number 45. The Focke-Wulf Foe 190 appeared over the English Channel in September 1941. and immediately proved superior to the Spitfire 5 that the RAF was flying. It was faster, it rolled faster, it climbed faster. In most respects, it outperformed the best aircraft Fighter Command could put in the air. For approximately 9 months, the Luftwaffe had air superiority over the Channel that it had been unable to achieve during the Battle of Britain. The RAF suffered significant losses from an aircraft it could not effectively counter. The Spitfire 5 was not malfunctioning, it was performing exactly as designed. The failure was not mechanical, it was developmental, the gap between the introduction of new enemy technology and the delivery of a response to it. The Spitfire 9, which had the performance to match the W190, entered service in June 1942 and restored competitive balance. But for those 9 months, pilots were flying equipment that had been state-of-the-art 18 months earlier, meeting aircraft that had moved beyond what their machines could answer. The equipment hadn't broken down, it had simply been overtaken. And in the sky over the Channel, being overtaken and being broken down produced the same result. Fact number 46. The winter of 1941 to 1942 on the Eastern Front was among the coldest Europe had seen in decades. It found the German army without adequate cold weather clothing, without lubricants designed for extreme cold, and without the maintenance procedures needed to keep equipment running below -30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: civilian clothing, curtains, newspaper. The standard Wehrmacht winter coat was a single wool greatcoat, inadequate for temperatures that the German Meteorological Service had consistently underestimated in its planning assessments for Operation Barbarossa. Vehicles that had started normally in autumn froze solid overnight and could not be started in the morning without heat sources that the army did not have in the quantities needed. Artillery mechanisms seized. Weapons carried at body temperature were often the only ones that could be relied upon to fire without preparation. The Soviet army, which had experience of the same winter, had cold weather lubricants, padded winter uniforms, and felt boots that their opponents lacked. The equipment failure of that first Eastern Front winter was not a single broken component. It was an entire logistics and planning system that had not taken seriously the possibility that the war would still be going when the temperature dropped below what the German army's equipment had been designed to handle. Fact number 47. The American XP-75 Eagle was a fighter aircraft developed under a program that promised a highly capable combat aircraft in record time by using as many existing components as possible. The tail assembly came from a Douglas Dauntless dive bomber, the outer wing panels from a Vought Corsair, the undercarriage from a Curtiss Helldiver. The idea was that using proven components would accelerate development and reduce the risk of unknown failures. What it produced was an aircraft whose borrowed parts did not work well together, handling characteristics that experienced test pilots described as dangerous. A tendency to snap into uncontrolled spins from which recovery was difficult. Performance figures that fell well short of what had been promised. 6 prototypes destroyed in accidents. The program was cancelled in December 1944, after absorbing significant resources and delivering nothing operational. The assembly of existing components that each worked well independently had produced a whole that was worse than any of its parts. A lesson in the non-additivity of engineering. The idea that combining good things does not automatically produce something good. That the wartime pressure to produce quickly at any cost had turned into a repeated and expensive mistake. Fact number 48. The British Matilda II tank was, in 1940 and early 1941, essentially impervious to any standard German anti-tank weapon then in service. Its armor defeated the standard German 37mm gun, and it dominated the early fighting in North Africa. It was also desperately slow. A maximum road speed of 15 miles per hour meant it could not keep pace with the mobile operations the campaign increasingly demanded, and it could not retreat from situations that had gone wrong quickly enough to matter. When the Germans began using 88mm flak guns in the anti-tank role, the Matilda's armor was no longer adequate. The 88 penetrated it easily at combat ranges, and the Matilda had no gun powerful enough to threaten the later marks of German armor. By mid-1942, It was obsolete in the role it had dominated 2 years earlier. The equipment that had been perfectly matched to the conditions of 1940 had been surpassed by the rate of development on the other side. Not a failure of the tank itself, but a failure of the assumption that a quality advantage achieved at one moment could be maintained without continuous development. The war consumed its own innovations faster than any single generation of equipment could keep pace with. The Matilda was simply one of the clearest examples of that truth. Fact number 49. The American bazooka gave infantrymen the ability to destroy tanks without being in a vehicle themselves. It was a revolutionary idea. Its execution had specific, significant limitations. The effective range was approximately 100 meters, falling off sharply beyond that because the rocket's propellant burned out quickly and accuracy degraded with distance. At 100 meters from a tank, in the open, the operator was also well within range of the tank's machine gun and any supporting infantry nearby. The weapon required 2 people, a gunner and a loader, both of whom had to expose themselves to deliver and reload. The backblast from the rocket prohibited firing from enclosed spaces without serious risk to both operators. The shaped charge warhead was effective against the side and rear armor of most German tanks, but often inadequate against the frontal armor of a Tiger. And in wet conditions, the electrical ignition system was prone to failure. Moisture could short the simple circuit and leave the operator holding an ineffective tube pointed at an advancing tank. The bazooka changed infantry anti-tank tactics fundamentally. Its failure modes were specific, well-known, and entirely capable of appearing at the worst possible moment. The weapon that changed everything came with a list of conditions under which it changed nothing. Fact number 50. The Royal Air Force's Avro Manchester bomber was withdrawn from frontline service in 1942 after a brief and costly operational life, and the reason was its engines. The Rolls-Royce Vulture was an ambitious design, 2 V12 blocks sharing a common crankshaft, creating what was effectively a 24-cylinder configuration. It suffered from reliability problems so severe and so persistent that no amount of development work could resolve them quickly enough for wartime use. Manchester crews gave the aircraft names that reflected their feelings about flying it. Engines failed over Germany. Engines failed over the North Sea. Engines failed during takeoff when the aircraft was low, slow, and heavy with fuel and bombs, with no height to spare if power was suddenly lost. The Manchester was retired as quickly as possible. Its airframe was redesigned to carry 4 Merlin engines instead. The resulting aircraft was the Avro Lancaster, one of the most successful and trusted bombers of the war. The Lancaster was so good and so reliable that it is easy to forget it was born from a catastrophic failure, that the Manchester's engines had to kill enough crews before the industry and the RAF accepted that the Vulture could not be fixed in time. The best bomber of the war grew from the wreckage of the worst engine. Fact number 51. In the closing stages of the war in the Pacific, Japanese forces on remote islands were operating with equipment that had been cut off from resupply for months, and in some cases years. The maintenance situation on some of these garrisons was defined entirely by improvisation, replacement parts built from whatever materials were available. Vehicles kept running with lubricants obtained from coconut oil. Weapons cleaned with whatever came to hand. The equipment that survived this kind of care was testimony to both the ingenuity of the soldiers maintaining it and the fundamental quality of the original designs. The equipment that did not survive, and much of it did not, left forces progressively disarmed not by Allied action, but by the quiet entropy of time and environment acting on material that could no longer be replenished. A garrison reduced to fighting with rifles whose barrels were worn smooth, with machine guns held together by improvised repairs, with artillery that had run out of ammunition months earlier. This was what equipment failure looked like at the far end of a broken supply chain. The war these soldiers were fighting in 1944 and 1945 was fought with what they had arrived with in 1942, minus everything that had broken or been expended in the years between. What remained was a measure of the gap between the designed life of military equipment and the life it was actually asked to live. Fact number 52. The story of the Mark 14 torpedo's failures would not be complete without the story of how long it took the United States Navy to believe the people reporting them. From the first weeks of the Pacific War, submarine commanders filed reports stating that their torpedoes were running deep, detonating prematurely, or failing to detonate at all. The Bureau of Ordnance, which had designed and tested the Mark 14, rejected these reports for over a year and a half. It suggested that the firing solutions were incorrect. It suggested that the crews were not maintaining the weapons properly. It suggested at various points that the reports reflected stress or inexperience, even when they were coming from experienced commanders with multiple patrols behind them. The problem was eventually forced into the open by submarine commanders who conducted their own tests. They set torpedoes to run shallow to see where they actually ran. They caught warheads in nets to demonstrate that contact exploders were shearing on impact. These tests confirmed everything the commanders had been saying. The institutional failure, the unwillingness of an organization to accept evidence that its own equipment was defective, cost the United States submarine force 21 months of effective operation. The torpedo failed, and then the system that should have fixed the torpedo failed to admit it. Both failures mattered. The second one lasted longer. Fact number 53. The Italian Navy had in one specific area equipment that was genuinely ahead of anything the Allies possessed in the early war years. Their human torpedoes, the maiale, meaning pig, were slow-moving underwater vehicles ridden by two frogmen who guided them to a target, clamped a detachable warhead to the hull, and then escaped before the time-delayed detonation. In December 1941, Italian frogmen using the maiale penetrated the harbor at Alexandria and attached charges to the battleships HMS Valiant and HMS Queen Elizabeth. Both ships were put out of action for months. It was one of the most effective single special operations of the war. But the maiale was also an equipment failure story in a different sense. It was extraordinarily physically demanding to operate. The training required to produce operators could not be quickly replicated at scale, and once the Allies understood what had been used against them, effective countermeasures followed. A weapon so specialized that only a handful of exceptional operators could use it, that worked brilliantly in specific conditions and could not be adapted to wider use, was a weapon that could change individual battles but not the overall balance of the war. A success in miniature, embedded in a larger failure. Fact number 54. The gas mask issued to British civilians at the outbreak of the war was taken seriously enough for every household to receive one. Regular drills were conducted. Its absence was a civic concern. It was also a piece of equipment that was never used in the way it was designed to be used, because Germany never launched the gas attacks the British government had anticipated. The mask's non-use became something of a symbol of the gap between preparation and actuality. Millions of people carrying an object designed for a horror that never came. But the mask's non-use should not obscure the fact that it was also imperfect equipment for the purpose it was designed for. The civilian mask was adequate against the types of gas used in the First World War, against the newer nerve agents that Germany had developed but never deployed. It would have provided only partial protection. The equipment was a response to a known threat from a previous war, built by people who understood what the last war had done and could not fully anticipate what the next one might bring. This is the fundamental equipment problem of every war. The people building the equipment know the last war better than the current one, and the equipment they build reflects that knowledge, faithfully and usefully, right up to the point where the current war asks a question the last war never posed. Fact number 55. The British Churchill tank had a troubled early life. When it first appeared in 1941, it was so plagued with mechanical problems that its manufacturer had to send teams of workers directly to frontline units to assist with maintenance and correct defects that had escaped the production process. The Churchill had been rushed into production under wartime pressure before its development was complete. The engine was unreliable. The track was prone to coming off the sprocket under certain maneuvering conditions. The mechanical design was complex enough that routine maintenance required skills the Royal Armoured Corps training programs had not yet produced. Churchill tanks took part in the Dieppe raid of August 1942, where almost all of them were lost. many before they reached the beach, most of the rest on the beach itself. The losses at Dieppe were partly the result of tactical decisions, but they were also partly the result of deploying equipment that was not yet reliable into one of the most demanding operational environments possible. The Churchill eventually matured into a capable and well-regarded infantry support tank, particularly valued for its ability to climb terrain that other tanks could not manage. The path to that maturity was paid for by the men who drove it before it got there, before the problems had been found and fixed, before the tank had become what it eventually became. Fact number 56. The M3 half-track was one of the most versatile vehicles of the war, used by American, British, Soviet, and Free French forces as a personnel carrier, a weapons platform, an ammunition carrier, and a command vehicle. It was also, in soft terrain, surprisingly vulnerable to getting stuck. The half-track's rear-driven tracks gave it better cross-country mobility than a wheeled vehicle, but the front-steered wheels were undriven, and they could bog in mud, sand, or snow in ways that left the vehicle immobilized even when the tracks behind were still turning. In the Ardennes in December 1944, half-tracks that moved off paved roads into the snow and mud of the forest frequently became stuck. They blocked roads, they impeded movement, they required recovery operations that consumed time and vehicle assets the tactical situation could not afford to lose. The half-track was a compromise vehicle, more capable than a truck, less capable than a fully tracked carrier, chosen because it was cheaper to produce and adequate for most purposes. The equipment that works adequately in most conditions fails in the specific conditions that most severely test the word most. And in the Ardennes that December, the specific conditions arrived that made adequate not enough, and the half-tracks that couldn't move told the story clearly. Fact number 57. The Panzerfaust was one of the most cost-effective anti-tank weapons ever built. Cheap, simple, requiring minimal training, and capable of penetrating the armor of any Allied tank at ranges up to 100 meters. Produced in enormous quantities through the last years of the war, it was also consumed by the conditions of those last years in ways that made its effectiveness uneven. The backblast from firing required open space behind the shooter. In the rubble of German cities, where much of the last fighting took place, that open space was often impossible to find, forcing operators to expose themselves to locate a position where they could fire safely. The weapon was single shot. No second chance, no reloading. If the first round missed or failed to detonate, the operator was now in the open with an empty tube and an enemy vehicle that had identified exactly where he was. The failure of a Panzerfaust left the operator in a significantly worse position than before he had fired. The weapon that was supposed to give individual soldiers the power to stop tanks gave them that power once, under conditions where everything had to go right, and left them with nothing if it did not. One shot, one chance, and the rubble all around making even that one chance harder to take. Fact number 58. The gliders used in the Normandy airborne operations were made of wood, canvas, and metal tube. Lightweight structures designed to carry jeeps, artillery pieces, and soldiers into territory that had no airfield. The Horsa glider was an extraordinary piece of engineering under the circumstances. It was also a piece of equipment that landed only once, and was then finished. The glider pilot brought his aircraft down in darkness, in fields that might contain obstacles, fences, ditches, or the poles the Germans had placed specifically to wreck them. Rommel's asparagus, they called those poles. Landing a fully loaded glider at night in an unknown field without lights was a test of skill and nerve that ended, always, in some kind of controlled crash. The glider that came in without hitting a pole or a ditch, and stayed in one piece long enough for its passengers to exit with their equipment intact, was a success. Many did not meet that standard. Gliders nosed over. They smashed wings on obstructions. They broke apart on ditches. They ran into other gliders that had landed in the same field moments before. The soldiers inside survived these crashes at rates that were better than might be expected given the conditions. Not all of them did, and every landing was a controlled crash into an unknown field in the dark, with the hope that unknown was not the same as dangerous. Fact number 59. The American Jeep is one of the great success stories of wartime equipment. Small, light, adaptable, rugged enough to survive the most demanding conditions, produced in numbers that made it the ubiquitous vehicle of the Allied war effort. But even the Jeep had its failure modes, and one of them was specific and lethal. Across European and Pacific theaters, enemy forces stretched wire across roads at Jeep windshield height. A simple ambush technique requiring no ammunition and no proximity to the kill zone. A Jeep moving at road speed hitting a wire at neck height was not survivable. The Allied response was a rod fitted to the front bumper, tall enough to catch the wire before it reached the windshield and hold it up while the vehicle passed beneath. Some Jeeps had these fitted, some did not. The modification required someone to know the threat existed, to have the rod available, to have fitted it before the patrol went out. In the conditions of the war, the pace, the supply constraints, the 1,000 competing priorities, not every vehicle had every modification it needed. The wire that killed the crew that had not fitted the rod was a failure of the modification system as much as anything else. The threat was known. The answer was known. The gap between knowing and having done it was where the wire waited. Fact number 60. The Lancaster bombers that carried the bouncing bomb on the night of the 16th to the 17th of May 1943 were among the most precisely modified aircraft of the war. Bomb bays altered, turrets removed to reduce weight, special spotlights fitted beneath the fuselage to allow the crew to judge their altitude over the reservoir at night. The bouncing bomb worked. It breached the Mona and Eder dams and flooded the Ruhr Valley. But the weapon was deeply demanding in ways the remarkable story of the raid sometimes obscures. It had to be released from exactly 60 feet altitude, at exactly 220 miles per hour, at exactly 425 yards from the dam face. Tolerances so tight that the training required to achieve them consumed months and multiple practice drops. A weapon that worked when all parameters were met failed completely when any one of them was not. 8 of the 19 Lancasters on the raid were lost. The damage to the dams, though significant, caused less permanent disruption to German industrial production than anticipated. The Germans repaired them faster than the planners expected. The Dambusters raid is rightly celebrated for the extraordinary courage it required. It is also a story about a weapon that existed at the intersection of tolerances so narrow that the difference between a direct hit and a miss was the difference between everything going right and any single thing going wrong. Fact number 61. The problems with American torpedoes were not unique to the Mark 14. The Mark 13 aerial torpedo, dropped from carrier aircraft, had its own set of failure modes that haunted the Pacific Air Campaign from the beginning. Dropped from the altitudes and speeds that combat required, higher and faster than the original design specifications allowed for. The Mark 13 frequently broke apart on water entry, ran erratically, or failed to arm itself at all. The pilots who flew torpedo attacks against Japanese ships in the early Pacific War were flying directly into the most intense anti-aircraft fire Japanese vessels could produce. Low altitude, low speed, committed to a straight approach, delivering weapons that often did not work. At Midway, on the 4th of June 1942, the American torpedo attacks failed almost completely. The torpedoes that were dropped missed or failed to detonate. Of Torpedo Squadron 8, only one man survived. And yet the attacks were consequential. They drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to low altitude, leaving the carrier decks exposed for the dive bombers that arrived minutes later and sank 3 Japanese carriers in 6 minutes. The torpedo attack that failed created the conditions for the success that followed. Whether that makes the failures acceptable is a question the historians who wrote about it afterward, and the men who died delivering those torpedoes might have answered very differently. Fact number 62. The German V-1 flying bomb campaign against Britain, beginning in June 1944, was a remarkable technical achievement. A pulse jet-powered cruise missile, produced in large numbers, aimed at a city-sized target, and difficult to intercept once in flight. It was also, as a strategic weapon, a failure. Its guidance system was simple enough that a significant fraction of V-1s fell short of or wide of London. The British developed effective countermeasures quickly. Barrage balloon cables caught and detonated some. Anti-aircraft guns repositioned to the coast shot down many more. RAF fighters learned to fly alongside V-1s and tip their wings with a wingtip, destabilizing the flying bomb's gyroscope and sending it into the ground before it reached its target. The V-1 that was supposed to terrorize London into submission instead accelerated the development of air defense techniques that became foundational to post-war doctrine. The guidance system was a simple magnetic compass and an air log measuring distance, accurate enough for a city-sized target, not accurate enough for anything more precise. The equipment worked, the strategy it was supposed to implement did not, and the engineers who built it could not fix that gap because it was not an engineering problem. It was the problem of a weapon that could reach a city but could not decide the war, no matter how many times it arrived. Fact number 63. Among the most painful equipment failures of the entire war were the failures that happened during rescue operations. The air-sea rescue system, the network of flying boats, high-speed launches, and aircrew survival equipment intended to recover pilots who had ditched in the sea, was never as effective as it needed to be, partly because the survival equipment itself was unreliable. Aircrew survival radios were too fragile for the violence of a crash landing at sea. Life rafts that did inflate sometimes could not be entered by a pilot who was injured or unconscious. Survival suits meant to provide thermal protection in cold water leaked at their seams. The British and Americans both worked continuously to improve air-sea rescue equipment throughout the war, and both significantly improved their rescue rates over time. But the improvements came in response to a continuous stream of aircrew deaths from equipment failures that were identified, documented, and only slowly fixed. Each delay represented specific, identifiable people who died in the water with equipment that should have saved them but didn't, not because no one cared, not because the problem was invisible, but because the gap between understanding a failure and correcting it at scale took time that the people in the water did not have. The sea did not wait for the next improved version. Fact number 64. The German Tiger II, the King Tiger, was the heaviest tank to see significant combat service in the war. It weighed approximately 70 tons. Its gun could penetrate any Allied tank at combat ranges. Its frontal armor could not be reliably penetrated by Allied tank guns in return. It was also so heavy that it destroyed bridges, broke roads, consumed fuel at a rate the German logistics system of 1944 and 1945 could rarely sustain, and broke down with a frequency that meant far more were lost to mechanical failure and abandonment than to enemy action. At the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the unit equipped with King Tigers lost more tanks to mechanical breakdown and fuel shortage than to Allied fire. A tank that could not be reliably fueled was not a tank. It was a steel pillbox, fixed in place by its own mechanical limitations. And while a fixed steel pillbox is not entirely useless as a defensive position, it was not what the offensive plan had called for. The King Tiger was the logical endpoint of a tendency to prioritize armor and firepower over reliability and logistics. It produced weapons of individual magnificence and collective inadequacy, magnificent and immovable, and running out of fuel in the snow. Fact number 65. The fundamental equation of armor versus anti-tank gun ran through the entire war. Each advance in one produced a response in the other. Neither side ever pulled so far ahead that the other could not answer, and the result was a continuous arms race in which the equipment fielded at any given moment was always either the latest response to a threat that had already been answered, or a threat that had just outpaced the equipment meant to counter it. The Sherman adequate in Tunisia in 1943 was inadequate in Normandy in 1944, not because the Sherman had changed but because the German tanks and guns it was meeting had. The Panzer IV that had been the best German medium tank of 1941 was obsolete by 1943. The war consumed its own tank designs faster than any peacetime development cycle could replace them, producing a situation where the equipment that soldiers actually fought with was almost always somewhere between the last generation and the next one. Adequate in most situations. Inadequate in the specific situations where adequacy was not enough. And it was always in the specific situations, the tight corner, the unexpected engagement, the moment the plan had not accounted for, that adequacy showed exactly where its edges were. Fact number 66. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 was one of the most operationally successful single strikes of the war. It also achieved less than it appeared to achieve, partly because of an equipment priority decision made during the planning. The American aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor when the Japanese struck. They were at sea. The Japanese planners knew this and had hoped to catch them in port. When they were not there, the decision was made to proceed with the attack and focus on the battleships. The battleships damaged and sunk at Pearl Harbor were, in the context of the Pacific War that followed, less important than they appeared. Naval warfare in the Pacific was going to be decided by aircraft carriers, a fact not yet fully understood by the planners who chose to prioritize the battleships as their primary targets. The equipment they destroyed was equipment the war was about to make largely obsolete as the primary instrument of naval power. The equipment they missed, 3 carriers, was the equipment that would decide the war. The attack that was supposed to cripple the American Pacific Fleet damaged it less than it appeared, and the reason was that the most effective weapon it used was aimed at the wrong target. Fact number 67. The Soviet PPSH-41 submachine gun was produced in approximately 6 million units during the war. Cheap, simple, effective in close combat, and reliable enough for the conditions of the Eastern Front. It became one of the defining images of the Red Army's fighting style. It also had a drum magazine that was not interchangeable between different PPSH-41s. Each drum was fitted to a specific weapon during manufacture. Using a drum from one gun in another was liable to cause feeding problems. In the chaos of Soviet infantry operations, where ammunition and equipment were shared between units in the field, this lack of interchangeability manifested in jams and misfires at exactly the moments when continuous fire was most needed. A later box magazine version addressed the problem, and the drum was phased out of production. But the years during which the drum-equipped version was the primary Soviet infantry weapon were years in which millions of these guns were being used in ways their design had not fully anticipated, shared between soldiers, given to replacements who had not had their magazines fitted to their specific weapon. The specific failure mode of an otherwise excellent weapon, undermined by a detail of standardization that the production process had not resolved. One small gap in an otherwise sound design, and in the middle of a battle one small gap was enough. Fact number 68. Optical equipment, gun sights, rangefinders, binoculars, periscopes, was among the most technically demanding equipment of the war. Its failures had direct consequences for the accuracy and effectiveness of the weapons it served. The German optical industry produced some of the finest military optics in the world. The gun sights on German tanks and artillery were generally superior to their Allied counterparts in clarity and precision. A well-sighted gun was a more dangerous gun. As Allied bombing of German industrial centers intensified through 1943 and 1944, the precision manufacturing required for high-quality optics became increasingly difficult to maintain. Replacement optics produced under wartime pressure, with substitute materials and disrupted production lines, were of lower quality than the originals they replaced. Tank crews who had trained on excellent sights found themselves operating with replacements that were less clear, less accurate, and more prone to condensation and fogging. A tank gun accurate to 1,500 meters with a good sight became accurate to 800 meters with a poor one. Not a failure of the gun itself, a failure of the precision component that made the gun useful at range. The degradation of German optical quality in the war's last 2 years is one of the less dramatic but genuinely significant equipment failures of the conflict. The weapons were still there, they simply could not see as far as they once had. Fact number 69. The air raid siren was among the simplest pieces of equipment deployed during the war, and its failure had consequences that were disproportionate to its simplicity. The British civil defense warning system depended on a network of wired sirens connected to a central control system that received warnings from the radar chain and the observer corps. When the sirens worked, they gave civilians approximately 4 minutes of warning, enough time to reach a shelter if the shelter was close enough. When the sirens failed, through power cuts, mechanical failure, or damage to the wiring network, people went about their normal activities while enemy aircraft were overhead. There were documented cases during the Blitz, and later during the V-weapon campaign, of areas receiving no warning because the local siren network had been disrupted. The consequences of a siren failure were not dramatic in the way that a burning tank is dramatic. They were the absence of something that should have happened. The silence where a sound should have been, and people going about their lives in the gap where the warning should have been but wasn't, with no way of knowing that the gap was there, because the nature of a missing warning is that you don't know it's missing until it's already too late to need it. Fact number 70. The German Nebelwerfer was a multi-barreled rocket launcher that fired salvos of large-caliber rockets. It was feared by Allied troops partly for its destructive effect, and partly for the distinctive wailing sound the rockets made in flight. Soldiers called it the screaming Mimi and the moaning Mini. It was also prone to specific failure modes that its fearsome reputation does not include. The rockets could misfire, leaving a launcher loaded with a combination of fired and unfired rounds, creating a dangerous situation for the crew. The firing sequence required careful execution that combat stress and enemy fire could disrupt. The weapon's backblast and smoke signature made the launch position immediately visible, requiring the crew to move the launcher straight after firing before Allied artillery could respond. This required a vehicle with sufficient mobility to leave the position quickly. When the vehicle was unavailable, or when the terrain made rapid movement impossible, the crew was left in a position they had just advertised to every Allied artillery unit within radio range. The weapon that announced itself loudly, in every sense, was a weapon whose survival depended entirely on being able to leave before the announcement was answered. The sound that terrified Allied soldiers also told Allied gunners exactly where to aim. Fact number 71. The British Royal Navy's Type 271 surface search radar was one of the most important equipment successes of the Battle of the Atlantic. A centimetric radar set small enough to be installed on convoy escort vessels, capable of detecting surfaced submarines at night and in poor visibility. It was also, when first installed on ships at sea in 1941, frequently broken. The magnetron, the component that generated the centimetric radar signal, was fragile in ways the designers had not fully anticipated. The vibration of a ship's machinery, the shock of depth charge explosions, the general violence of naval operations in the North Atlantic in winter. All of these could damage the magnetron in ways that took it offline at exactly the moments when the escort was most likely to need it. Ships carrying working Type 271 sets had a significant advantage over submarines. Ships carrying Type 271 sets that had been shaken offline by their own depth charges were carrying the weight and complexity of a radar installation without the capability. The development of the Type 271 is a story of one of the war's genuine technical triumphs. It is also a story of the gap between a technical triumph in the laboratory and a reliable piece of equipment on a convoy escort in the North Atlantic in January, where the sea does not care what the specifications say. Fact number 72. The American bazooka captured by the Germans in North Africa in 1942 became, within months, the German Panzerschreck. A larger, more powerful version of the same weapon, more effective against armor than the original that had inspired it. This is one of the war's more striking equipment stories. The American weapon that was captured inspired a German response that outperformed the weapon it was copied from, at a time when the original designers had not yet produced their own improved version. The Panzerschreck had a larger caliber, 88mm against the American 60mm, giving it a larger warhead and greater penetrating power. It was heavier and less portable, but in fixed defensive positions that weight mattered less. It also had a problem the original bazooka did not. The backblast and propellant gases from the larger rocket were dangerous enough to the operator's face that a shield had to be fitted, adding weight and limiting visibility. The capture and improve cycle ran through the entire war, one side's equipment becoming the other side's inspiration. Each failure or limitation of one generation driving development of the next on both sides simultaneously. The war was a continuous, accelerated experiment in what worked and what did not, and sometimes the clearest lessons were learned from the equipment of the enemy. Fact number 73. The Volkssturm units called up by Germany in the last months of the war were equipped with whatever the industrial system could still produce: Panzerfausts in large numbers, older rifles, improvised ammunition, whatever was available from storage or captured stocks. The equipment failure story of the Volkssturm is not the story of any specific defective weapon. It is the story of a complete mismatch between the equipment being issued and the demands being placed on the people receiving it. Men in their 50s and boys of 16 were handed Panzerfausts and told to stop Soviet tanks. They were not given the training to use the weapons effectively. They were not given the support to maintain them. They were not given the tactical framework to employ them in ways that matched the weapon's very specific requirements. A Panzerfaust in the hands of someone who understands it is a serious weapon, someone who knows the backblast requirement, the range limitations, the moment to fire and where to aim. A Panzerfaust in the hands of someone who received it 30 minutes earlier in a trench facing an armored column is a piece of equipment that will either do nothing or kill the person holding it. The equipment did not fail in the conventional sense. The system that was supposed to make the equipment effective had already failed before the weapons were handed out. Fact number 74. The British Fairey Battle Light Bomber was obsolete before the war began. It was slow, underarmed, under-armored, and lacked the range and bomb load to be effective. The RAF knew this. The Fairey Battle had been designed in the early 1930s and was already considered a second-line aircraft by 1939. The problem was that there was nothing immediately available to replace it. When Germany invaded France and the Low Countries in May 1940, the Fairey battle squadrons based in France were ordered to attack German columns crossing the Meuse and the Albert Canal bridges. The crews who flew these missions knew that the aircraft they were sitting in was inadequate for what they were being asked to do. The losses were catastrophic. On the 12th of May 1940, the squadrons attacking the Maastricht bridges suffered losses so severe that 2 crews who volunteered for a second sortie after returning from the first were awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. The equipment failure here is not a technical one. The Fairey battle worked as designed. The failure is the gap between the equipment available and the task required. The institutional and resource limitations that had left frontline squadrons in aircraft whose own designers would have been reluctant to recommend for combat. The crews flew them anyway. That part, at least, did not fail. Fact number 75. The American M1 helmet, the steel pot, was one of the most recognizable pieces of equipment in the Allied arsenal, issued to virtually every American soldier, designed to protect against shell fragments and glancing blows from small arms. It did this reasonably well. It was not designed to stop a direct hit from a rifle bullet. It did not do this. The distinction between what the helmet was designed to do and what soldiers sometimes believed it would do was a source of occasional confusion. The helmet was sometimes described as bulletproof, and soldiers occasionally made decisions about cover and exposure based on confidence in their helmet that its actual performance did not justify. The helmet's inner liner served dozens of secondary purposes that soldiers found for it over years of living with the object: shaving bowl, wash basin, cooking pot, improvised shovel in soft ground. These secondary uses were not failures. They were the typical creative adaptations that soldiers make to the objects they live with for long enough. The failure, such as it was, lived in the expectation gap, the distance between what the equipment was believed to be and what it actually was. In combat, that distance was occasionally the difference between a decision made with accurate information and one made with a story that felt true but wasn't. Fact number 76. The Japanese Betty bomber, the Mitsubishi G4M, was called the Flying Lighter by Allied pilots for the same reason the Sherman tank and the He-177 earned identical nicknames. It burned easily. Like the Zero, the G4M had been optimized for range and performance at the expense of protection. Its fuel tanks were unprotected, igniting readily from even a brief burst of gunfire. Allied fighter pilots quickly learned that a single short burst into the wing fuel tanks was almost always sufficient to start a fire that could not be stopped. The aircraft was used throughout the war despite these deficiencies. because the Japanese aviation industry could not produce a replacement quickly enough, and because the operational demands of the Pacific required a medium bomber with long range regardless of its survivability. The crews who flew it knew its limitations in the specific way that combat crews always know. Through experience. Through watching the aircraft beside them in the formation go down. Through the quiet calculations of probability that people make when the machine they are flying is one that fires easily, and the people trying to make it fire are all around them. They flew it because it was what there was, and they understood, with a clarity that no briefing document had provided, exactly what that meant. Fact number 77. The British 2-pounder anti-tank gun was the standard British anti-tank weapon at the outbreak of the war, and the main armament of many British tanks in 1940 and 1941. Its penetration performance was adequate against German armor in 1940. It could defeat the Panzer III and Panzer IV at combat ranges. By 1942 it could not defeat the up-armored versions of those same tanks, and the problem was compounded by a specific omission. The 2-pounder had no high explosive shell in British service. An anti-tank gun that can only fire armor-piercing rounds is useless against infantry, unarmored vehicles, field fortifications, and anything else that requires explosive effect. British tank and anti-tank crews in North Africa who needed to engage soft targets were firing solid shot that passed through unarmored vehicles without detonating and ploughed into the ground on the far side. The lack of high explosive ammunition was a development and procurement failure. The assumption that the 2-pounder's role was exclusively anti-armor, combined with the difficulty of producing a suitable high explosive shell, had left frontline units with a weapon being asked to do things it could not do. In a theater where the targets were not always the armored vehicles it had been designed for, that gap was felt every single day. Fact number 78. Operation Market Garden required everything to go right simultaneously. The airborne forces holding the bridges, the ground forces driving up the single road, the communications connecting them all. None of it went entirely right, and a significant part of what went wrong was equipment. The radios that could not reach across the terrain around Arnhem have already been described, but there was also a ground dimension to the equipment failure. The single road that 30 Corps was driving up was so narrow that a single knocked-out vehicle could halt the entire column. This happened repeatedly. A burning half-track, an immobilized tank, a bridge whose load rating turned out to be lower than the map suggested. Each one a stopper, a pause, a gap between where the relief force was and where it needed to be. The road reconnaissance had been based on information that the actual conditions did not match. German demolitions, soft verges that swallowed heavy vehicles, road surfaces that were not as solid as they appeared. The ground vehicles moved slower than planned on a road that was not as good as assumed, using communications that did not reach as far as specified, in an operation that required all the equipment to perform at its best-case specifications simultaneously. None of it failed catastrophically. All of it performed slightly worse than needed, and the gap between slightly worse and needed was the bridge at Arnhem. Fact number 79. The American M3 submachine gun, the grease gun, was designed as a cheap, simple replacement for the Thompson submachine gun, which was well made and expensive. The grease gun was cheap, it was simple, it could be produced at the scale the war required. It was also slow-firing, inaccurate beyond very short range, and prone to jamming if dirt entered the magazine well, which it did, because the magazine well served double duty as the weapon's cocking handle. Opening it to cock the gun and accidentally leaving it open in a muddy foxhole introduced exactly the contamination needed to stop the weapon at the worst possible moment. Its low rate of fire, around 450 rounds per minute compared to the Thompson 700, was partly deliberate, intended to make ammunition last longer. But in close-range engagements where the opponent was firing faster, the grease gun operator was at a rate of fire disadvantage that deliberate design had created. It was not a bad weapon for the price and the production context. It was good enough for what it was designed to be. Good enough for the price is not the same as what the men carrying it needed it to be. And that gap between the weapon as designed and the weapon as needed is where most of the war's equipment stories quietly live. Fact number 80. Sea mines deployed in enormous quantities by both sides during the war. worked with terrible reliability, reliable enough that clearing them after the war took decades. Some areas of European coastal waters are still finding them today, but sea mines also failed in ways that had strategic consequences. The British magnetic mine, effective enough that German shipping in the North Sea suffered significant losses from it in late 1939 and early 1940, was compromised when a German minesweeper investigated one that had landed on tidal flats in shallow water without detonating. German engineers examined it, they studied it, and they developed degaussing technology, a system of electrical cables run around a ship's hull that neutralized its magnetic signature and made the ship effectively invisible to the magnetic mine's trigger. The mine that failed to detonate when it was examined gave the Germans everything they needed to defeat one of Britain's most effective early war naval weapons. A failure in the most literal sense, a mine that did not go off, set back the British naval mining campaign in ways that took months to address. The mine that worked destroyed a ship. The mine that didn't worked against the people who had built it. Both outcomes were the consequence of the same design, meeting two different moments, in two different ways. Fact number 81. The American forces fighting in the Aleutian Islands campaign of 1943 encountered conditions that exposed equipment failures in ways that temperate climate testing had never anticipated. The Aleutians are among the most hostile environments on Earth. Wet, cold, and persistently foggy, with winds that make normal operations impossible for days at a time. The combination of cold and moisture there is different from either dry Arctic cold or warm tropical wet, and it defeats the preparations made for both. American soldiers who arrived with standard Pacific theater equipment, designed for heat and rain, found it inadequate for cold. Those who arrived with cold weather equipment found it could not cope with the specific combination of cold and wet that the Aleutians produced. Boots that were waterproof froze. Boots that were warm became sodden. The casualties from trenchfoot and frostbite in the Aleutian campaign were among the highest rates suffered by American forces in any theater because the equipment issued was not designed for this specific environment, and designing equipment specifically for the Aleutians was not something anyone had done before the campaign demonstrated that it was necessary. The Aleutians did not appear in the design brief of any piece of equipment that was sent there, and the Aleutians noticed. Fact number 82. The failure of the German surface fleet to challenge Allied sea lanes after 1942 was partly strategic and partly the consequence of specific equipment problems the German Navy could not resolve. The battleship Bismarck, lost in May 1941 after a brief commerce raid, demonstrated the vulnerability of surface raiders operating without adequate air cover. The Tirpitz, the Bismarck's sister ship and the most powerful battleship in the European theater, spent most of the war in Norwegian fjords. Its presence tied down significant Allied naval resources even though it rarely ventured out. It was eventually sunk by RAF Lancaster bombers carrying tallboy deep penetration bombs in November 1944. The Scharnhorst was sunk by the Royal Navy in December 1943. The surface fleet that Germany had built with such ambition in the late 1930s was progressively eliminated by a combination of radar that found German ships in the dark, aircraft that could reach them in harbor, and weapons that could penetrate their armor. The failure of the German surface fleet was, in the end, partly the failure of equipment to operate in an environment that the enemy's equipment had fundamentally transformed. An ocean that had once been navigable became, for German surface ships, a place where being found and being sunk were increasingly the same thing. Fact number 83. The V-2 ballistic missile was the most technically advanced weapon of the war. The first ballistic missile to reach the edge of space. The direct ancestor of every rocket built since. A product of engineering that was decades ahead of anything else being attempted anywhere in the world. It was also, as a weapon of terror against cities, a profound operational failure. The V-2's guidance system used gyroscopes and accelerometers accurate enough to hit London in the general sense but not in any more precise sense. The average margin of error was several kilometers. A weapon aimed at central London might hit anywhere within a circle several kilometers across. This made it useless against anything smaller than a city. Useless against military targets. Useful only for terror. and its terror effect, studied carefully by British government assessors, turned out to be limited. People were frightened by V2s because they arrived without warning, without the siren and shelter routine that had given the Blitz its manageable psychological shape. But they did not break morale. The V2 program consumed enormous German resources, fuel, industrial capacity, and the forced labor of thousands of people worked to death in underground factories. The engineering triumph was real. The weapon it produced was a failure, and the distance between those two things is one of the war's more sobering measurements. Fact number 84. The specific combination of sand, heat, and mechanical complexity that the North African campaign imposed on equipment was demonstrated with particular cruelty by the British Crusader tank. The Crusader was fast and relatively well armed for its period, but its engine, the Nuffield Liberty, was an American First World War aircraft engine adapted for tank use, and it required a standard of filtration and maintenance that the desert made almost impossible to maintain. The Liberty was sensitive to dust in ways that German engines were not. Crusaders pushed hard through the dust and heat of the desert, suffered engine failures that left them stranded at rates that disrupted operational planning at every level. Commanders could not count on their full complement of Crusaders being present for any given operation, because a significant fraction would break down during the approach march, before the battle had even begun. An armored force that cannot reliably reach the battle is an armored force that has already conceded something before the first shot is fired. The plan that assumed full strength would discover, on the morning of the operation, that full strength was not what had arrived. The desert had not been in the engine's design brief, and the engine made that clear every day in the only way an engine knows how. Fact number 85. The P-47 Thunderbolt was one of the most capable and durable American fighter aircraft of the war. Heavy, powerful, able to absorb punishment that would have destroyed a lighter aircraft. Its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, was a masterpiece of reliability. But the P-47 had a range problem that significantly limited its usefulness as a bomber escort in the early part of the strategic bombing campaign over Germany. It could not accompany B-17s deep into Germany. Its fuel capacity was insufficient. The bombers that flew past the point where their P-47 escorts had to turn back for fuel were unescorted for the most dangerous part of their mission. German fighters had learned to wait. They held back until the escorts turned, then attacked the bombers in concentrated groups during exactly that window. The losses during the unescorted portions of deep penetration raids, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and others in 1943, were catastrophic. The solution was the drop tank, an external fuel tank jettisoned when empty, and eventually the extraordinary range of the P-51 Mustang, which changed the strategic bombing campaign entirely. But before those solutions were available, the bombers flew unescorted into Germany, and the equipment that was adequate for the first phase of the campaign was not adequate for the phase that mattered most. Fact number 86. The German army's dependence on horses has already been described as a logistical vulnerability, but it was also a source of equipment failures in the more conventional sense. Horse-drawn artillery remained the standard for German divisional fire support throughout the war, and it required horseshoes, harnesses, veterinary medicines, and fodder in quantities that the German logistical system struggled consistently to provide. Horseshoes worn smooth on the frozen roads of Russia provided insufficient traction, causing horses to fall and injure themselves or damage the vehicles they were pulling. Harnesses that rotted in the damp of the Soviet autumn and were not replaced in time caused teams to break free of their loads at critical moments. The specific failure of horse-drawn logistics is both the most archaic and one of the most consequential equipment stories of the war. Not the failure of metal and gunpowder, but of leather and iron, of the oldest military technology still in wide operational use during the most mechanized war in history, meeting conditions for which it had no more tolerance than the newest tank had shown for the mud that stopped it. The horse and the tiger broke down in the same winter, for different reasons, with the same result. The army that depended on both could not move. Fact number 87. The American proximity fuse, the variable time fuse, was one of the most important weapons developments of the war when it finally arrived in quantity for ground use in late 1944. But in the months before it was cleared for land use in Europe, there was an intermediate stage that represented its own kind of equipment limitation. The fuse was available, it was proven, it was being held back. American naval forces in the Pacific had been using proximity fuses against Japanese kamikaze attacks with excellent results since 1942. The technology worked. The decision to withhold it from land use in Europe was a deliberate security decision. The risk of duds falling into German hands, allowing German engineers to copy the technology, was considered greater than the benefit of its immediate deployment. This meant that Allied artillery crews in Italy, in Normandy, in the Rhineland, were operating without a technology that existed that would have increased their effectiveness significantly, and that was being kept from them not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well to risk the enemy discovering it. The equipment that was too good to use is a category of failure that conventional equipment history rarely includes. But it is a real one, and the crews who fired their artillery without it, in the months it was being withheld, were paying a cost that the security calculation had decided was acceptable. Fact number 88. The American M10 tank destroyer was built on a modified Sherman chassis, intended to provide mobile anti-tank capability that the Sherman's gun was increasingly unable to supply. Its 76mm gun was an improvement, but the vehicle had an open-topped turret, a choice made to reduce weight and improve the crew's field of vision that left them exposed to artillery fragments, small arms fire, and any infantryman who could get onto the vehicle. In the Normandy hedgerows and the narrow streets of German towns, where infantry fought in close proximity to armor, the open turret was a serious vulnerability. M10 crews improvised armor, sandbags stacked along the turret rim, additional steel plates bolted or welded in place. But improvised armor added weight the vehicle had not been designed to carry, affecting the mobility and mechanical reliability it had been built around. The open turret was a design trade-off, better visibility and reduced weight in exchange for crew protection, a reasonable choice in the environment the designers had envisioned, a problematic one in the environments the war actually produced. Most design trade-offs in the war followed this pattern. They were reasonable where they were made, and they were tested somewhere else, in conditions the designer's office had not contained. The M10's open sky was fine until the battlefield decided to use it. Fact number 89. Among the most systematically studied equipment failures of the war were the failures of Allied bomber aircraft that did not return from missions over Germany. The statistical analysis of aircraft damage patterns, looking at which parts of returning aircraft were most often hit, led to work by a statistician named Abraham Wald, who pointed out something that seems obvious once stated, but had not been. The relevant data was not the patterns on the aircraft that returned. It was the patterns on the aircraft that did not. The aircraft that returned had survived. Their damage patterns showed where a bomber could be hit and still fly home. The aircraft that had not returned had been hit somewhere else, somewhere that a hit was fatal. The places on returning aircraft that showed no damage were therefore the places where additional armor was most needed, because those were the places that caused aircraft to not come back when struck. Wald's work is now taught as a classic example of survivorship bias, the systematic error of drawing conclusions only from the data that is available, when the most important information is contained in the cases that are not represented. The equipment failure here was not mechanical. It was a failure of reasoning, and fixing it required not a new component but a different question, asked of the same evidence that had always been there. Fact number 90. The development of the atomic bomb represented both the ultimate equipment success and the ultimate equipment failure of the Second World War. As a technical achievement, the Manhattan Project was extraordinary, the most complex and expensive scientific and engineering program ever undertaken, completed in 3 years, producing a weapon that worked the first time it was tested. As an outcome, its legacy is more complicated. It ended the war. It also ended the world that had existed before it, not immediately, not completely, but irreversibly. The equipment that the Manhattan Project produced worked so well that it created a situation in which the equipment itself, rather than any strategic objective, became the defining condition of international relations for decades afterward. The bomb did not simply win the war. It changed what winning and losing meant. It created a category of weapons so destructive that using it was, in most circumstances, indistinguishable from losing. Because the world in which victory would need to be experienced would not survive the weapon's use. The equipment that worked perfectly, that did exactly what it was designed to do, that ended the deadliest conflict in human history, also made every subsequent conflict more dangerous in ways that are still being reckoned with today. The greatest engineering success of the war, and perhaps its most consequential failure. Both things at the same time in the same object. Fact number 91. The German Tiger's frozen wheels. The Sherman that burned. The Zero with no armor for its pilot. These are the famous equipment failures, the ones that found their way into the standard narrative of the war. Less remembered are the failures of the support systems, the equipment that was supposed to keep the equipment running. The German maintenance system for its most complex tanks required specialist tools and trained mechanics, both of which were frequently unavailable in forward areas. A Tiger that shed a track, which happened with some regularity given the complexity of its wheel system, required a recovery vehicle capable of towing 55 tons. That capability was rarely available in the quantities needed. Tigers disabled by mechanical failure in forward positions had to be abandoned if recovery was not immediately possible. Leaving a recovery crew beside a broken tank while a battle moved around them was effectively a sentence. So the equipment that could not be recovered was not simply a maintenance failure. It was a tactical decision forced by the inadequacy of the recovery system relative to the weight and complexity of the equipment it was supposed to support. Heavy tanks that cannot be recovered when they break down are tanks that get destroyed by their own army's retreat. The Germans destroyed enormous numbers of their own Tigers for exactly this reason. Not by enemy fire, by circumstance. Fact number 92. The parachute flares used by Allied night bombers to illuminate targets over occupied Europe were pieces of equipment whose failure modes had direct consequences for what was actually bombed. A flare that ignited at the wrong altitude, or drifted in unexpected wind, or burned for less time than specified, or failed to ignite at all, changed the illumination of the target zone in ways that could redirect the entire bombing stream onto a different location entirely. The Pathfinder Force, the specialist squadrons whose job was to mark targets accurately before the main force arrived, was the solution to the problem of bombing accuracy. But the accuracy of the Pathfinders was only as good as the accuracy of their equipment. Markers that drifted, flares that failed, target indicators that burst at the wrong altitude. The bombing of Nuremberg on the night of the 30th to the 31st of March 1944, the worst single night for Bomber Command in the entire war, with 95 aircraft lost, was partly a navigation failure and partly an equipment failure, marking blown off course by strong winds. Main force crews following drifting indicators onto open countryside. The accuracy of the entire attack determined by the precision of equipment that the weather was actively working against. The bombs that should have fallen on Nuremberg fell across 50 miles of German countryside instead. Fact number 93. The American M18 Hellcat tank destroyer had the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored fighting vehicle of the war. It destroyed more enemy armor relative to its own losses than any other American tank or tank destroyer in the conflict. It achieved this partly because of its extraordinary speed. It was the fastest tracked armored fighting vehicle of the war, capable of 60 miles per hour on roads, which allowed it to flank enemy armor, disengage from unfavorable situations, and reach firing positions before the enemy could reposition. But the Hellcat's speed was partly a product of the same design philosophy that had made the Zero dangerous and fragile. Armor had been sacrificed for mobility. The Hellcat's thin armor made it highly vulnerable to any German tank gun of the period, and the crews who operated it were acutely aware that their safety depended on never being caught in a frontal exchange with a Tiger or a Panther. The tactical doctrine developed for the Hellcat, exploit speed, use flanking approaches, avoid frontal engagement, shoot and move, was correct. It was also a doctrine built entirely around a specific equipment limitation rather than a specific equipment strength. The fastest armored vehicle of the war was fast because it could not afford to be slow. Both things were true at the same time, and the crews lived in the space between them. Fact number 94. Sometimes the equipment worked exactly as designed, and the design itself was the failure. The French Char B1 bis heavy tank of 1940 was, by the standards of 1937 when it was designed, a formidable machine. Thick armor, heavily armed, built for the kind of set-piece infantry-supported assault against fixed positions that French military doctrine considered the defining form of modern land warfare. The German campaign of May 1940 was not this kind of warfare. It was fast, fluid, and fought over distances and at speeds that the Char B1 bis, slow, with a limited fuel range and a demanding maintenance requirement, could not cope with. The tanks that should have dominated the battlefields of France were used in fragments, without adequate logistical support, in operations that their range and pace made impossible to sustain. Many were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they ran out of fuel, or broke down, and the pace of the German advance left no time to recover them. Equipment designed for the last war, meeting equipment designed for the current one, in a campaign that proved the difference. France in 1940 is the clearest and most costly example of that particular failure. Not a broken component, an entire concept outrun. Fact number 95. The German army that entered Stalingrad in the autumn of 1942 brought weapons and equipment designed primarily for open field warfare. The city transformed the equipment calculus entirely. The 88mm gun, whose flat trajectory and high mounting made it devastating on the open steppe, was nearly useless in the rubble of city streets. Too large to maneuver, too tall to conceal behind anything a city block provided. The tanks that had crossed the Soviet plains found that city streets were traps, narrow, overlooked, full of cover for infantry carrying anti-tank weapons. Every window a potential firing position. The standard German combined arms approach, tanks, infantry and artillery working together with room to maneuver, required space the city refused to provide. The Soviets, who had been defeated repeatedly in open country, developed new tactics in the rubble that exploited the limitations of German equipment in ways that open terrain had never allowed. They closed so tight to German positions that German artillery could not fire without hitting its own men. They fought simultaneously in basements and on upper floors, negating the ranges at which German weapons were most effective. Stalingrad did not change the German equipment. It changed the environment in ways that made the equipment's strengths irrelevant and its weaknesses dominant. The weapons were the same, the ground they stood on was not. Fact number 96. The British Boys anti-tank rifle was a 0.55 caliber single-shot weapon capable of penetrating the armor of early war German light tanks. By 1941, it could not penetrate the armor of the standard German medium tanks it was most likely to encounter. The Boys rifle did not become less effective between 1939 and 1941. Its penetration performance was unchanged. German tank armor became thicker and more carefully angled, in response to the experiences of the Polish and French campaigns. The weapon that had been adequate became inadequate through no fault of its own design, simply because the threat it was designed against had evolved beyond it. This pattern repeated itself in every category of anti-tank weapon on every side throughout the war. A heavier weapon was developed, which required the other side to develop heavier armor, which required a more powerful weapon again. The equipment race had no finish line. It had only a front, the current generation of armor against the current generation of penetrator, and both sides ran it for the entire duration of the war, each generation adequate at the moment of its introduction, obsolete within 18 months. The Boys rifle was simply the first to fall behind in a race that never stopped moving. Fact number 97. The M4 Sherman's successor, the M26 Pershing, arrived in the European theatre in February 1945, months before the war ended. It had the gun and armor to fight German Tigers and Panthers on even terms. It arrived too late for the battles that had cost the most Sherman crews. The entire story of the Pershing's late arrival is an equipment failure of a different kind, not a failure of the machine, which was capable and well designed. A failure of institutional decision-making. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department had been aware since 1942 that the Sherman was inadequate against the latest German armor and had been working on heavier tanks. The decision to continue producing Shermans rather than switching to heavier vehicles was made partly for logistics reasons and partly because of debates within the Army about what tanks were actually supposed to do. The tank was meant to exploit breakthroughs, not to fight other tanks. That was what tank destroyers were for. The doctrine did not match the battlefield, and the doctrine was slow to change. The Pershing that arrived in 1945 was the equipment that the men fighting in 1944 had needed. It arrived for the men who were still fighting in 1945. And the gap between needed and arrived was measured in everything that happened in between. Fact number 98. The V-1 flying bombs that Germany fired at Antwerp in the autumn and winter of 1944 hit the city with a higher success rate than those aimed at London, partly because Antwerp was smaller and less defended, and partly because the shorter trajectory meant smaller navigation error. But the V-1 campaign against Antwerp also demonstrated the weapon's limitations in a different way. Antwerp's port was essential to Allied logistics. The largest port in northwestern Europe, its rapid opening after liberation, was one of the most important logistical achievements of the campaign. The V-1s aimed at denying the Allies its use hit the surrounding city instead, killing approximately 4,000 civilians. The port itself, whose disruption would have been the strategically rational objective, was not reliably struck. The weapon that was supposed to deny the Allies the use of Antwerp's port instead killed the civilians of Antwerp while the dock workers continued working. The equipment failed to achieve its strategic objective while achieving its human cost with terrible efficiency. A weapon accurate enough to reach a city, not accurate enough to reach a port within that city. The difference between those two levels of precision was the difference between a weapon that changed the campaign and a weapon that only grieved it. Fact number 99. The WWII jet bomber made reconnaissance flights over Britain in 1944 and early 1945, but no Allied aircraft in service could intercept because none could simultaneously reach its altitude and match its speed. It was a glimpse of how quickly air warfare was going to change, and how soon the equipment designed for the current war would become irrelevant to the next one. But the R-234, like the Me-262, arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. Its jet engines suffered from the same material shortages and reliability problems as every other German jet engine of the period. Its operations were limited by fuel shortages that grounded it more often than enemy action. Its ground support infrastructure was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing and the contraction of German-held territory. The most advanced aircraft of the war could not function at the level its design required, because the present it had been built into, its fuel supplies, its spare parts, its airfields and workshops, was already failing around it. The future had arrived in the middle of a collapsing present, and the collapsing present was not interested in what the future required. The R-234 flew missions no one could stop, and then it ran out of fuel and sat on a cratered airfield and waited for an end it could not prevent. Fact number 100. The failure that nobody planned for, that no engineer designed against, that no logistics officer could have anticipated, was the failure of soldiers themselves to maintain their equipment under the conditions of combat. Maintenance requires time, tools, materials, shelter, the physical and mental capacity to do careful, detailed work. Combat provides almost none of these. Soldiers who had been awake for 36 hours, cold and wet and under intermittent fire, whose tools had been lost or damaged, whose cleaning materials had run out 3 days ago, maintained their equipment as best they could, which was often not well enough. The rifle that jammed because it had not been cleaned. the radio that failed because its battery had not been replaced, the vehicle engine that seized because its oil had not been checked. These were not design failures or production failures. They were the failures of human capacity meeting the demands of a situation that exceeded what human capacity can reliably deliver. Every piece of equipment in the war was designed with some maintenance requirement. Every maintenance requirement assumed conditions that the front line did not provide. The gap between the maintenance the equipment needed and the maintenance the soldiers could give it was filled, always, by the equipment failing. And the consequences of that failure fell on the men around it, who had done everything they could and found that everything they could was sometimes not enough. Fact number 101. The last equipment failure of the war was not dramatic. It did not happen in battle. It happened in the silence after the guns stopped. In the Pacific, unexploded American, Japanese, British, and Australian ordnance still lay in the coral and sand of islands that had been fought over with such intensity. In Europe, German bombs that had not detonated on impact lay under the rubble of rebuilt cities. In the North Atlantic, mines drifted in currents they were not designed for, detonating when ships passed over them years after the war was over. German construction workers in Frankfurt in 1956, in Hamburg in 1962, in Berlin in 1994, in Cologne in 2012. Each time digging up bombs dropped during the war, still capable of detonating 8 decades later. Citizens evacuated from their homes during these discoveries, living within the operational envelope of weapons designed for a war that ended before they were born. The equipment failure that is still happening today, the bomb found under a school playground, the mine that catches a fisherman's net, the ordnance that surfaces during a flood, is the final chapter of a story about machinery built to do violent things, still very slowly doing them, long after the war ended, long after the people who made them are gone. The equipment is still there, still failing, still patient, still waiting for the right conditions to finish what it started. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment, as the night settles around you. Every piece of equipment in these stories was built by someone who believed it would work. The engineers who designed the Mark 14 torpedo thought they had built an effective weapon. They had tested it as thoroughly as secrecy and budget constraints allowed, and it had passed those tests. The people who placed the flap and gear controls side by side in the B-17 cockpit were solving other problems, weight and reach and ergonomics. And they did not see the confusion that exhausted pilots would later experience, because they were not the pilots, and the cognitive conditions of a combat approach were not available in a design office. The German engineers who specified the Tiger's interleaved wheel system were solving a real weight distribution problem. They solved it elegantly, without being able to fully anticipate what would happen when their elegant solution met a Soviet winter. This is the central truth that runs through all of these stories. Almost none of the failures in this series were the result of laziness or indifference. They were the result of the inevitable gap between the conditions in which things are designed and the conditions in which they are used. Every weapon and every vehicle and every piece of kit in this war was built by people working in offices and factories, with the best information available to them, solving the problems they could see against threats they could model. And then the equipment was sent somewhere the office and factory could not follow. To the Libyan desert, to the Soviet winter, to the depths of the Pacific Ocean, to the streets of Stalingrad, and the conditions that were not in the design brief showed up and found all the places where the design had been optimized for something that was not this. The Sherman was a good tank in the conditions it was designed for. The V1 was technically impressive for the problem it was supposed to solve. The M1 Garand was, taken as a whole, genuinely excellent, one of the best individual weapons of the war. The boy's rifle was perfectly adequate against the armor it was designed to defeat. The failures were not, in most cases, in the design. They were in the distance between the design and the war. There is a lesson here about humility that the war taught at enormous cost. Equipment is always a model of its designer's understanding of the world, complete within the scope of that understanding, limited at its edges. The war was nothing but edges, and here we are, at the end of these 101 stories about things that broke when they were needed most.